5, 4, 3, 2.
My guest today is Shmuel Tamir, the former Minister of Justice in the Israeli government. Mr. Tamir, the American public watched very closely the heated 1981 elections in Israel, and a couple of things that are very puzzling to the American public is, number one, the multiplicity of parties in the Israeli system, and number two, it seems to us that there are a lot of high-level resignations. Moshe Dayan resigned, Ezra Weizman resigned, and of course you yourself resigned from your post. So could you explain those two phenomena?
Well, multiplicity is not a new phenomenon. We have the proportional representation and not the regional personal representation that you have. I wish it would change, but this is the situation. And right from the beginning of the state, there were very many parties. In the 1981 parties, the phenomena was that most of the small parties disappeared. And the main remaining parties were the Likud, which is the governmental party, and the Labor. And in addition, two small religious parties, small but strong, because without them, neither the Labor nor the Likud could have formed the government. This is the answer to your question number one.
Of course, let me just comment on that. Really, for the first time, the American media focused on the fact that no Israeli government ever gained the majority of seats in parliament, no single party, that there has always been a coalition government. And I think that was a fact, which of course is well accepted in Israel, but which was widely misunderstood in America.
I would say it's accepted in Israel. I don't know whether it's well accepted in Israel. It started with Ben-Gurion, the late Prime Minister, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel, who decided that rather than join with Herut, which is today part of the Likud, the so-called more conservative element, it will be easier and more convenient to rule the country if he joins with the religious party, gives in on a number of religious issues, and on the rest, on the balance, they actually go along with whatever he decides politically, both in external affairs and in internal affairs. And this became a tradition for whoever took over among the non-religious parties. But this time, and we saw a progress in it, some of the smaller parties disappeared, and the country is turning gradually into a two-party country, with the religious groups in the center as yet, but they too have shrinked in number, not in influence. As to resignations, resignation did take place. 5 ministers have resigned from the previous government prior to the elections, me included, for different reasons. Free country, democracy, there were differences of opinion, differences of situations and approaches. And towards the end of the session of the last parliament, the 9th, and the previous government, it seemed that people faced very grave decisions relating to both external and internal affairs. And when they didn't see their way coming through, they preferred to resign. This was anyway the case with 2 names that you have mentioned, both ex-generals, Moshe Dayan, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Ezra Weizman, Minister of Defense. Of course, the criticizers of those who resigned charge us for being too individualistic.
Not sufficiently loyal to the party.
No, well, this differs with the case.
But why did you resign?
Some of them, for example, Moshe Dayan did not belong to the Likud. He left the Labor to join Mr. Begin in his government.
As foreign minister.
I resigned for different reasons. I wasn't totally happy with what was going on, but my party, the Democratic Movement, has shrunk in numbers in Parliament, and I felt that we were overrepresented proportionately in the government, which was unfair. And for this and other reasons, I have decided to give up the post of Minister of Justice, which I liked and enjoyed, and which was very, I believe, if I may say, fruitful.
Well, you see, the Democratic Movement for Change is perceived in America as an extremely liberal party, whereas Begin's Likud party is considered to be extremely conservative, at least trying to analogize it to the American system. And yet you were a cabinet member in Begin's government, which would really be unheard of under the American system.
Because it was a coalition, and in a coalition each party gives some ground and, to go towards the other in order to build up a force which will be able to run the government. And we gave in on some points. They went some way towards us. But again, generalization of parties is always not exactly accurate, because within the Likud, for example, you have more liberal elements and more conservative elements. The same is true about the Labour Party. Within the Labour Party, you have today hawks and doves, just as you have some of them in the Likud as well. In your Democratic or Republican Party, you have similar phenomena. It's a Democratic party. I believe that Israel does need a change, and I don't know how you feel about your presidential system, or how the French feel about their presidential system. I belong
I like our system if I like the president. If I don't like the president, I tend not to like our system.
I came to the conclusion that what we need is a presidential system rather than a parliamentarian one, to have a stronger government with the checks and balances of parliament. And I believe that the French have found a real good solution. De Gaulle formed it first, and then everybody thought that it was tailored on such a huge personality as he only. But then came Pompidou and Giscard and now Mitterrand, and the system works. And while in France, prior to Second World War, governments fell and were established every few months, now the regime is much more solid. Not always friendly to Israel, but this is another story, but internally much more solid, more influential internationally, because there is a stronger government, and we are a country in a situation which needs decision, needs a strong hand, and I believe that a strong presidential system is the barrier against unwanted moods towards an autocratic state.
Well, one of the criticisms, or at least one of the comments that's always heard in the States in regard to Israel's parliamentary system, is the way it's worked out in practice is that it gives the religious parties representation all out of proportion to their true numbers and to their true strength in the nation. Is that valid?
I think it is valid. For example, in the previous session of Parliament, which lasted some 4 years, we've introduced many new liberal legislations in many aspects. For example,
Okay, sorry, Kat. We're just going to change cassette and we'll continue.
Okay.
At the end of the tape. If you'd like to... ומר תמיר ידבר. כן. 3.
We've introduced a good number of new bills which liberalize the regime in the country. For example, up to a year ago, we had inherited from the British a very harsh preventive law for security cases, preventive detention law. Now we have changed it totally, and we made it subject to judicial supervision. We have introduced a Privacy Act, which takes good care of the private citizens and his private life. We've introduced a bill against eavesdropping and so on. But when we wanted to go further, like having a full-scale constitution for the country, a written constitution, which we still don't have, there we faced with an ultimatum of the religious party that no. Their reason was that they were very much afraid that the secular power of the secular court will become much more dominant above the religious court in comparison to the present situation. This is one example where secular parties or semi-secular parties, whether the Labour or the Likud, have to give in partially to religious party in order to maintain a government. Sometimes this situation is highly exaggerated locally and abroad, But basically, it is there for the last 30 years, and this is the construction of the population. They are represented this way, and so long that the Labour and the conservative liberal Likud will not form a mutual government, thus becoming totally independent and free from the religious party, this situation will continue.
Well, what percentage of the Israeli population is Orthodox in the strict sense?
Well, this is a very difficult question, because what is in the strict sense? On Yom Kippur night...
I'm not here to ask easy questions.
On Yom Kippur night, practically the whole country is in synagogue, and the same applies to Rosh Hashanah. People go and have their marriages before rabbis, most of them willingly, not because they are forced to. So in that sense, are they religious? Are they traditional? But to be that religious as to have it dominate your political opinion and vote for a religious party, you have 10 to 15% of the population. This is where they have their own influence. People like me, for example, who consider themselves traditional, with deep respect to religion, feel that religion would have had much greater influence in Israel, especially in the great dilemmas that the new generation is facing. And with the destruction of all the old dogmas and their disintegration, original religion could have had much more influence had it not taken a shape of political parties. Because many a time you find a situation where religious intervention in political affairs yields a certain transitional gain for the party, but is raising a sense of unhappiness and sometimes a desire for a moral revolt on the part of a majority which is not anti-religious, but wouldn't like to see too much intervention.
They would like to de-emphasize it.
That's right.
I'm going to give you a rare opportunity today in this sense. Frequently, when American Jews and American Gentiles have a discussion about the Middle East, the American Gentile will frequently say to the Jewish American, well, I can understand why you're so strongly pro-Israel, because you're Jewish, but come on, realistically, from my standpoint as a Christian in America, I'm interested in cheap oil, and it has never really been explained. It's extraordinary how many Americans, both Jew and Gentile, do not really understand, strategically or otherwise, the reasons why it is in America's interest to be strongly pro-Israel. So the opportunity I'm giving you is to explain why it is in their own selfish self-interest to be strongly pro-Israel, and it really doesn't have all that much to do with whether you're Jewish or not.
Thank you. I do believe that in addition to the moral commitment, as was emphasized by all American presidents towards Israel because of the mutual way of life, because of the democratic stability and so on, there is a much more prosaic element why every American, Jew and non-Jew alike, should back Israel and try his best to keep it strong as only possible. We live in an area which, on top of being the cradle of civilization, is the focus of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The long desire and dream of Soviet rulers, whether they were Tsars or communist leaders, to approach and get hold of, as they desire to come to what they call the warm water of the Mediterranean. And their thrust towards Africa and this part of the world is one of their main ambitions, knowing that whoever has control of this area is practically controlling what Winston Churchill described as the soft underbelly of Europe. Now, in this part of the world, Israel still today is the only solid, basic, democratic bastion that America can rely on. I say still today, fully appreciating the great advantage of having, in the last few years, created a very close and good relationship with President Sadat of Egypt. But only today, while you talk to me, President Sadat had to put in prison 1,500 people, very influential people, religious and otherwise, in order to prevent an upheaval of his regime. And the Sadat, who is pro-Western, who made peace with Israel, who has shown both courage and wisdom, may be a beginning of another Egypt, but may eventually turn to be an episode which will be changed by another regime. This is not the case with Israel because of its structure. I recall visiting Washington, D.C. only 3 years ago. And when I was sitting with people in the Department of State or Senate, Capitol Hill, and describing the importance of this bastion called Israel, small as it is, but solid and firm, I was given to understand time and again that the real great ally to rely upon in the Middle East is a much larger country and much wider, more heavily populated, closer to the Soviet Union, Iran. And everybody told me, Iran is the bastion, we should back Iran, we should pour arms to Iran, money, everything. You, in addition, are important, but Iran, don't forget Iran. That's what I was told by very good and close friends of Israel.
And what is really sad from the American perspective, knowing how very high-level people did view Iran, we were unable to keep the Shah in power. And with what's happened in Iran in recent days, many people are coming to the view that the Shah was in many ways a great man, that he was able to maintain some stability in what has turned out to be a lunatic asylum.
Exactly. And I mention Iran in order to indicate at temporary allies who are not to be relied on. And I feel that Sadat is a very courageous man, and I hope his regime stays. But it is still not a democratic regime. It is not a regime which came into power by elections, and we don't know how long it is going to stay. While Israel is a democracy, and Israel facing Syria, facing Jordan, which is lately trembling and winking towards the Soviet Union as well, and the great new Iran, if I may call, Saudi Arabia, where everybody believes here is the real ally to rely upon. Well, if America feels that it should negotiate, I can fully understand. It should feel that it should make efforts to win over Saudi Arabia, well understood. But not to see the fact that Saudi Arabia basically is a kingdom run by one family, which over one bad night may face the fate of another country, if I may mention, Libya, which was very friendly to America.
And people forget had a king.
And they had a king, and the king was loyal to America, and he went on a leave. And while he was on leave, a man, colonel by the name of Gaddafi, took over, and today Libya, with its madness as described by President Sadat, is a real threat in the heart of the Mediterranean. So Israel here, true, taken for granted, and sometimes the fact that you are being taken for granted doesn't help you, but taken for granted is the most solid pillar in the area militarily, economically, and therefore I believe, with all modesty, that America needs Israel. Israel needs America tremendously, and I know the proportion, but having the proportion in mind, one should remember that it's a two-way traffic.
Well, interestingly, Israel returned the Sinai after the '56 war. They are now returning the Sinai again, almost unheard of developments in the history of warfare between sovereign states, where a country that gains territory in war gives it back. And the point you make, that if Sadat goes, Israel may have to recapture the Sinai a third time in order to have it, in order to have the protection, because who knows what is going to be the situation in Egypt once Sadat leaves, however he decides to leave.
This is a thing very important, and I think you rightly pointed at it, that people in America and in Europe tend to forget. I'm one of those who raised the hand to decide that we should give in the whole of Sinai back in consideration for peace. And when I did it and I was asked as a lawyer, did you sign a good contract or a bad one? My answer was, I don't know whether it was good or bad. It was a contract that had to be signed. We took a risk with open eyes, a very heavy risk which you have just described. We gave in tangible assets, the vast territory of Sinai, the only oil under our control, 10 airfields, including 3 extremely important, I believe the most modern in the world airfields, definitely in the area. We gave in for the first time against all sentiments, wonderful, flourishing settlements which were grown out of the desert by the toil of our boys. All this was given in consideration of an imponderable asset called peace.
And intangible.
Intangible. We did it, as I say, with open eyes, because after 30 years of siege and wars, 5 very heavy and painful wars, we decided to risk and to try the other course. But we were the giving side in a very great extent, to a very large extent, and people, when they talk to us and they describe Israel as being obstinate, intransigent, tend to forget it. And I believe one should remind everybody about these proportions as well, not forgetting for a moment the courageous act of President Sadat.
Well, how do you really explain his PR, public relations genius, in the sense that, as you well know, Sadat does better in American polls than any Israeli politician, and with the history of Pearl Harbor and the whole John Wayne syndrome of a fair fight, the '73 war which was started on the holiest day of the Jewish year, that seems not to be held against Sadat at all, but simply by virtue of saying he recognizes Israel's right to exist and willing to enter into direct negotiations with Israel, and Israel giving up an area 6 times larger than the entire country of Israel. How do you basically explain how Sadat has managed to do that with the American public? Because it really is an extraordinary accomplishment.
Well,
he's extraordinarily popular there.
First and foremost, what he did was courageous. His arrival in Lod Airport with in his aircraft, I was standing there with the government. When I looked and I asked myself, is it true? Is it true? Is it reality? This shock effect had its impact not only in America but in Israel as well. He was very courageous physically and dramatically, and I thought it'll go into the annals of mankind as a fantastic gesture, which wasn't unilateral. We gave our share, but his part was the physical appearance in Jerusalem in the Knesset. Then he is a first-class operator in PR, and by saying this, I don't diminish from other virtues of his. And in addition, we Israelis, in a way, are more similar to you Americans. While Egypt and its environment and its leadership is not as well known and not as close to America as our life, and people tend to adore or to get fascinated by something which is a bit strange or far from their usual way of life. You may here and there criticize us, the Israelis, that for the last 30 years we could have made a better presentation of our case than we actually do. Whichever is the government, perhaps this may be also added. But all in all, one shouldn't forget the American side. You have now a new president, but your previous president, who was not re-elected, did contribute very seriously in a very dramatic way and very clever way to the Camp David Accords. And I wonder whether without the American cooperation, this new reality, which we hope will last, could have come to be and to pass.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about President Reagan vis-a-vis the Israel-U.S. relationship?
It's a bit new.
Please. Same question.
On the next cassette.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'd like to do just a couple of intercuts.
Yes.
Just nod and yes.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
So yes.
Yes, no.
We've passed most of
Maybe.
the way.
Don't talk, only look and reaction.
Look at Mr. Tamir.
מר תמיר, תאמר לו כמה מילים. בבקשה לך. Five. Four. מי מתחיל? אוקיי. 3, 2.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about President Reagan vis-a-vis Israeli-American relationships and in terms of his being a friend to Israel?
Well, we are part of the free world. And if I view the new American president from a global point of view, I feel satisfied, judging from the first few months, that there is leadership, there is firm attitude. Apparently there are no illusions about the Soviets, which is very important, and a certain regaining of American prestige, level, and standing internationally. And I think this is very important, judging from here. This is internationally. And one can judge this from abroad, and I don't want to interfere on internal issues. By the way,
Interfere all you want. It's perfectly okay.
by the way President Reagan is handling the internal affairs as well. As far as Israel is concerned, I don't know whether a policy, a new policy, or a continued policy was shaped. I hope that the same principles which I've just mentioned internationally from a global point of view, when applied to the Middle East, will be automatically interpreted into strengthening of Israel and turning the unwritten alliance between Great America and small but important Israel into even more solid solidarity and cooperation. Of course, there are issues, even among the best of friends, where some elements of interest not necessarily coincide between the two, and these have to be threshed out. I believe and hope that they can be threshed out especially with the new administration, judging from their overall policy and philosophy. But it's too early, and I hope that this direction, which I'm pointing at, will come true.
You had mentioned earlier the case of Iran, and very damaging to the American psyche was to permit a nation such as that, with leadership such as that, to hold 52 perfectly innocent Americans who had done that nation no harm for some 14 months. And the Americans, who became very, very frustrated about that situation, basically always used two countries as an example. Could you imagine, they said, if that had happened to the Soviet Union, or if it had happened to Israel, always using Entebbe as an analogy? I'm asking you to be quite frank about this, because I know that a lot of Israelis thought that America was absolutely disgraced, permitting Iran to hold their people for some 14 months. What are your views on that?
Well, to be fair to the previous administration, America cannot be compared in this respect neither to the Soviet Union nor to Israel. Not to the Soviet Union because whether it was a true story or not, but they said that a certain high official, Soviet high official in the UN was asked what would have the Soviet Union done had 52 or 54 Russian hostages been taken in captivity in Iran. And he smiled and he said, in 15 minutes there would have been no Iran. A Russian, a communist, a totalitarian can speak this way. America cannot, because it is America. America cannot be compared with Israel, because sometimes when you are very big and your move may decide the whole globe, you have to be somewhat more cautious, because the stakes are higher. This one should say, with all the criticism that was uttered here and abroad as to the handling of the hostages. At the same time, not being at the wheel, and it's different when you're not at the wheel, I don't know all the potentialities and the possibilities which were open. For us, it seemed inconceivable that a giant like America, with all the limitations, with all the cautiousness, could not find a way which will prevent the impossible invasion of American territory, which is the embassy in Tehran, and let it go for such a long time.
Yeah, you used
there, I believe, I wasn't at the wheel, and I don't know what were the possibilities, but there is the test for imagination, for ingenuity, for determination, and a certain amount of risk-taking. And the performance...
None of which qualities were really exhibited in the rescue mission.
Unfortunately, and this was the technical, operational level, which simply didn't work. There too, of course, there is always an element of luck. Entebbe was a fantastic, unbelievable success. Well planned, well organized, well performed. But we know today that one wheel of one of the planes, had it advanced another few meters, the whole operation would wound up differently. So in every operation, military or civil, luck is an element. When all is said and done, and with all the defenses that I, as a lawyer, would raise for the unsuccessful operation and the omissions and the commissions, we have expected more, and we felt a breeze of fresh air when we had your new president taking over and telling the world America is going to be different. This without diminishing from great contributions which the previous president, and history will prove it, have given to the cause of peace and to other very important challenges which faced him. And I say it because I think it's only fair.
There was a movie shown on American television that was called Masada, that was shown in prime time over a period of 3 or 4 nights. And one of the very telling lines in that program was when the leader of the Jews was speaking to the Roman general, played by Peter O'Toole, after much frustration and discussion. And O'Toole was portrayed, the Roman general was portrayed as basically a reasonable type of guy who did not want to kill all the Jews. But the Jewish leader said, "Haven't you learned yet the way to really destroy the Jews? Just leave us alone and we'll destroy ourselves." And some people have used that line to give it some added dimension in terms of, particularly in the 1981 election in Israel, with the divisions between the secular, the religious, the Ashkenazi Jews, the Oriental or Sephardic Jews, those types of conflicts, what does the future portend if Israel were to be left alone? Because obviously neither the Zionists nor the religious people founded the state of Israel so that a Sabra born in Israel would leave and go to New York City and become a cab driver. That was not why Israel was formed.
Well, with all the pessimistic interpretation to the statement of O'Toole and to the Jewish leader, I view it differently. I was born in this country, I grew in this country, I participated in all the ups and downs, and I think it's greatly exaggerated. As to the Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews, this is a matter of time. In the last 6 months, I've attended 10 marriages. All of them, without exception, were Ashkenazi girl with a Sephardi boy or vice versa.
Mixed marriages.
Mixed marriages. So you have mixed marriages, and the products are terrific. So this will be overcome. Now we have our quarrels and debates and heated debates and stormy elections. You should have been here on the day of election, following all the storms and fireworks and attacks and whatnot. A calm, organized, disciplined, civilized nation, 80% going to the polls, making their choice quietly and calmly, exemplary. And as to internal debates, yes, we debate. We control, we master our tongues. It's a nation of orators and writers and whatnot. But when the real danger faces us, all this turns to become so superficial, so unimportant. And then you have a united nation. And you scratch it a little bit, and you face a very angry nation if it is under danger. And it has proven itself this way in the last 100 years of Renaissance. I remember from books when we were here, 100,000 Jews, and the Turks, the ruthless regime was here, and how we started to revolt and take care of the Turks. And then I remember in person, as a boy, British were here, the British Empire of then, with 100,000 British soldiers, the Navy, the Air Force, and we were a few hundred boys with a few revolvers, with no money, no international backing, no Jewish backing. And on the 15th of May, they had to leave the country, and the Israeli sovereignty and the Israeli flag were over Jerusalem and part of the land of Israel. And then the Six Days War.
That's a good note to end on, Mr. Tamir.
And the 6 Days War and so on. So, without boast, we are here to stay as a strong, modern, prosperous nation of the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay?
You want to end doing again?
Whatever.
Because the sound, the level is very low. If you want.
Which end? The second end?
No, את הסיום רק. את הסיום.
איזה סיום?
of your microphone.
כן.
So what do you need for me to say?
החוט של מי זה? שלו. מנחה? You must only thank you very much, Mr. Tamir, and that's
Now?
yeah, 1 minute. Close the jackets.
Oh,
Close
no, artist,
no, like this. That's it.
And put your hands like that. That's it.
Okay, shh, quiet.
Mr. Tamir, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Guys,
very much.
thank you.
Thank you.